Hey guys, Spirit of the Lie here. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Condottiero, specifically to really explore the question of which ally civilizations benefit the most from an Italian ally giving them access to the unit. Just to briefly cover the role of the Condottiero, this is an Imperial Age team unit for the Italians and their allies, which has some similarities to the Champion, albeit without requiring the same series of upgrades, making it quick and relatively cheap to transition to. Its other notable feature is that it's anti-gunpowder, both negating incoming hand cannoneer bonus damage, as well as having an attack bonus against gunpowder units of all kinds. Now, the devs have to be careful when balancing these sorts of team units, as aside from Italians, there are 44 other potential bonuses and unique unit interactions to consider, with over a third of civilizations having some relevant bonus or tech to affect them. In addition to just strong infantry bonuses, we could also consider civs that have a tech tree gap or weakness that even a generic Condottiero can fill to round out a civ that's otherwise held back in some way. For example, there are 4 civilizations missing both champion and supplies, as well as Persians, who miss two-handed swordsmen entirely, though of that list, the Tatars are the ones that jump out in particular to me, having 2 of their worst matchups being against the gunpowder civs, Bohemians, and Hindustanis. So it feels like there may be moments the Condottiero could really come in handy. Still, I want this list to go in a bit more overtly strong direction, and to give it a bit of objectivity, I tested all the major contending Condottieri against each other in melee, as well as checked how many shots they can take from a variety of ranged units to help inform a top 10 list and give us some more concrete numbers to refer to. Starting us off at number 10, we have the Teutons. Their relevant bonus is an extra 2 melee armor on the Condottiero, as part of their bonus affecting all infantry and cavalry. Believe it or not, while that sounds pretty significant in melee battles, they're only number 8 in melee fights against other Condottieri on this list, while then having nothing extra against ranged units. It's enough to sneak into the top 10, and certainly the Condottiero can be useful, and for Teutons are above average in melee, but nowhere near the best. Next up, at number 9, we have the Italians. I wasn't sure if I was going to include them or if this list would focus only on Condottiero allies, but I think it's worth highlighting both where the most commonly seen Condottieri land, as well as highlight the fact Italians actually have a decent unique tech for the unit, giving it +1/+1 armor. While they're number 10 in terms of melee ability on the list, that +1 pierce armor is a bigger deal than it might seem. It equates to an extra 2 shots from arbalesters and heavy cavalry archers, as well as a massive increase in resilience against elite skirmishers, taking nearly 50% more shots than usual. Considering the Condottiero can at times be called upon to play a bit of the militia line's anti-trash role, I think this puts them just ahead of the Teutons. Moving on to number 8, we have the Slavs. Now this one could arguably go higher, and technically Slavs are actually number 2 in melee if we test using 15 Condottieri head-to-head, so it feels like I'm going back on my premise of having this somewhat informed by objective testing. Their advantage is of course thanks to the unique tech Druzhina, giving them some area damage with each attack. In battles like this, they can look overwhelming, but that partly reflects this is exactly the type of fighting where Druzhina looks great, having large numbers of clumped up units for maximum splash damage. With more spread out units, their advantage is greatly reduced or even eliminated. Any bonus that relies on an expensive unique tech, as well as your opponent committing to a very specific type of melee fight, to me keeps it out of the top tier, as impressive as they may look in the scenario editor. Next up, we have what I'll consider a 3-way tie between the Japanese, Aztecs, and Dravidians, all with very similar sounding bonuses that thrive in slightly different situations. Japanese attack 33% faster, Aztecs have +4 attack after unique tech, and Dravidians ignore melee armor with a unique tech as well. While they're all sort of getting at the same thing with more damage output, what makes them tricky to rank relative to each other is that their strength depends on the melee armor of what they're up against. Against a lightly armored target with 0 or 1 melee armor, Japanese faster attacking Condottieri do the most damage out of the group. Against 3 melee armor though, Aztecs instead do the best, and against units with 5 or more melee armor, Dravidians are not just the best, but become increasingly more so. For the most part, Japanese look like they're probably the weakest in practice, considering fully upgraded melee units will often have at least 3 melee armor after blacksmith techs, but it's also the only one of the set that comes from a passive bonus, where the other 2 have to pay quite a bit up front. Overall, these 3 can share ranks 5 through 7 on the list in arguably any order. Against average units with 3 or 4 melee armor, really you're getting about the same result out of all of them, and all 3 I'd consider infantry-focused civs who would benefit from having an anti-gunpowder option. Moving on, at number 4 we have the Vikings. They have several things helping out their Condottieri, with 20% more HP from a civ bonus, and a unique tech giving them +5 against cavalry, and a bit of gold generation when raiding, especially against monks and trade cards. Maybe surprisingly, they don't end up doing amazingly well in the melee test, ranking just 7th on the list, behind the previous 3 entries with greater attack. That said, the extra HP does come in clutch against ranged units, placing them 4th in that category. What I like in particular for Viking Condottieri is they really fill that anti-trash role at a moment's notice, not only having the extra HP to take 5 more skirmisher shots and 1 or 2 more shots from hand cannons or arbalesters, but that they then throw in the +5 attack against cavalry. As we just saw with Aztecs, +4 attack is often quite similar to the Japanese faster attacking bonus, or even a little better. So against anything from Hussars to Paladins, the Viking Condottiero becomes decent in a role that unit usually isn't well equipped for. Considering it holds up at least relatively well to ranged units, cavalry, and of course gunpowder by its nature, it's quite the generalist unit, with something to address many of infantry's usual weaknesses. Next up, at number 3, we have the Armenians. Now, I would entertain an argument for swapping these with Vikings at number 4, though I'll give you my reasoning for why I have things this way. First off, they have +30 HP instead of the Vikings +16, so everything about the Vikings' melee ability and resistance to ranged units is doubly true for Armenians. Admittedly, they're not as good against cavalry units in particular, but that's not really what you make Condottieri for anyway, and the difference against Paladins, for example, is only a few percentage points of HP left over. Against ranged units though, Armenians' extra HP actually lets them perform 2nd best on our list, and are at least respectable in melee as well. They even have a team bonus sneaking in, giving them +2 line of sight, for what that's worth. Admittedly, they're probably not the first to come to mind when you think of top tier Condottieri, maybe in part because they're a relatively new civ, but I think they earn the spot. Moving on, at number 2, we have the Maulians. Now, while they lack the final attack upgrade, making them actually relatively poor in melee, in my opinion, they more than make up for that with their bonus giving them +3 pierce armor. To put that into perspective, against elite skirmishers, they take twice as many shots as the runner-up battalions, and 3 times the typical Condottiero. That advantage extends against really any ranged unit, far more than even Armenians with their 30 extra HP. Whatever they lose in melee, I think they make up for in being a rapid, effective transition against almost anything that does pierce damage. Now, before we get to number 1, I had a couple of quick honorable mentions that were considered but didn't make the list, and you might be wondering about. First, we have the Sicilians, and while yes, they take less bonus damage, remember Condottieri already ignore that from gunpowder units, meaning it only helps against a few odd exceptions like slingers, cataphracts, and jaguar warriors. I didn't think it was a long enough list to weigh very heavily. Next is the Burmese, who passively get +3 attack, which I just see as a worse version of the Aztecs +4. Admittedly, it is free, but Burmese only came in 9th in the melee rounds anyway, and were essentially bumped off the top 10 by the Pierce Armor Specialists. Another one to mention is the Celts, who move faster than others, and keep in mind the Condottiero is significantly faster than most infantry anyway, making Celt Condottieri comparable in speed to many cavalry units without husbandry. Ultimately though, they just feel a step behind the others on the list, at least stats-wise, even if their speed technically puts them physically a step or 2 ahead on the field. And then we have the Romans, who, despite double the effect from blacksmith armor, only end up having +1 melee armor when it's all said and done. If you zoom out, it's just basically a worse version of the Italians and Teutons, who themselves were already fringes on the list. And finally, we come to the number 1 Condottiero, which belongs to the Goths. Now, this may be a controversial pick, as lacking the final armor upgrade makes them actually the worst we've seen against ranged units, but I'll tell you why that doesn't matter. First, their discount, if factored in, lets them beat every other entry on the list with equal resources, including even the Slavs with Druzhina. They're then created 140% faster with the barracks, which for a unit that's all about a rapid transition and skipping the militia line upgrades further doubles down on that strength. As for their weakness to ranged units, yes, they take fewer shots in many cases than generic Condottieri, even taking 1 less shot than usual from hand cannons. But as Goths, are you actually worried about someone making ranged units against you? You have arguably the most anti-archer unit in the game. And even against hand cannons, when you consider their cost and factor that in, they can tank more hand cannon shots than anyone else. Ultimately, the Goths' major weakness at their barracks is enemy hand cannoneers, which counter their champions, halberdiers, and even the Huscarl to some degree with unblockable bonus damage. The Goth Condottieri fills that gap, removing one of the few units that can actually threaten your master game plan. As a part of the Goth late game, it really rounds them out in a way I don't feel to the same degree in other civs we've seen. So that's my top 10 list, and you're welcome to agree or disagree. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.